Hello everyone and welcome back to Noob. This video is part 3 of my 4-part Ultimate Guide series for Return of Rome, in which I covered fundamentals and economy in part 1, buildings and technologies in part 2, military and combat in this video, and water and navy in part 4. Since Return of Rome is a new game mode for AoE2 players, I figured that there would be a ton of them who would need a refresher on how AoE1 played out, or need to learn the game from the ground up to get up to speed with the rest. I've linked below all 4 parts of the series in the pinned comment below, and I've ensured that I'm as concise as possible, as tons of info is crammed into each part of this series. Alright, without further ado, let's dive into the military and combat of Return of Rome. Okay, so originally, this video was meant to be much longer and more detailed, as its script was more than 15 pages and slated to be around 45 minutes. Well, I've decided against this because 1. I felt that it was too long and detailed for the casual player to sit through and watch the whole thing, and 2. I'm running out of time for the announcement that I wanted to make all the way back in January, so I need to get the last 2 videos out ASAP. Hence, this video will cover all of the core fundamentals to get you up to speed with waging war in Return of Rome, and this guide should be more than enough for the majority of players out there. If you are already a high elo player yourself, then you're in the wrong place, as you should be watching pro games instead and study their nuanced engagements. Also, before we begin covering each military unit, I want to address something quickly. Combat in AoE1 or Return of Rome does not really follow the more streamlined rock paper scissors formula that AoE2 usually follows, in which pretty much every military unit has a clear counterpath that you can take. The combat system is a bit more nuanced and definitely muddier here for the average player, as there are quite a few units that don't have an upgrade path to the next age, some units are completely missing for certain civilizations, some units don't even have a clear-cut counter at all, or others have significant civ bonuses that tips the engagement in their favor. Of course, I'll explain this concept further in a moment. And finally, this video only covers land units and combat, as I will cover all things navy in part 4 of this series. Okay, with all these out of the way, let's get right into it. First, let's quickly go over which units are available in each age. In the Stone Age, you can only train Clubman in the barracks. In the Tool Age, you can upgrade your Clubman into Axeman and can begin training Slingers as well. Keep in mind that Slingers are actually ranged units despite being trained in the barracks. Slingers and Axemen do not get any further upgrades. In the Archer range, you can only train the Bowman, and in the Stable, you can only train the Scouts, and both of these units do not get any further upgrades. I do have to pause here now to make a very important point. Note that no unit I've mentioned so far upgrades into the Bronze Age. This effectively means that the game's combat completely changes Bronze Age onward with brand new units, as it is essentially divided roughly into the 2 sections of Stone and Tool Age, and later on with the Bronze and Iron Ages. In other words, while some Bronze Age units can still hold their own against Iron Age units, the opposite is definitely not true between the Bronze and Tool Age. If you're left behind with Tool Age units fighting against Bronze Age ones, the game is basically over. Without a doubt, this will be more evident once I cover how each unit fights into one another. Okay, let's go back to cover the Bronze Age now. In the barracks, you can train the Swordsman line, in which you start with a Short Swordsman, which can be upgraded to the Broad Swordsman in the same age, and later into Long Swordsman and Legion in the Iron Age. In the Archer range, you can train Chariot Archers, which will not get any further upgrades. Improved Bowmen can be researched to be trained and subsequently upgraded to Composite Bowman as well in the Bronze Age. Composite Bowmen do not get any further upgrades as well. In the Stable, you get access to the Chariot, which can be upgraded to the Scythe Chariot in the Iron Age, the Cavalry, which can be upgraded to Heavy Cavalry and later into Cataphract in the Iron Age, and Camel Rider, which does not have any further upgrades past the Bronze Age. In the Academy, you can train the Hoplite, which can be later upgraded to the Phalangite and further into Centurion in the Iron Age. In the Siege Workshop, you can train the Stone Thrower in the Bronze Age, which can then be upgraded into the Catapult and further into Heavy Catapult in the Iron Age. And finally, you can begin training priests from the Temple, and they have numerous technologies to research in both the Bronze and the Iron Age. In the Iron Age itself, you can train the Elfin Archer, which has no further upgrades, as well as the Horse Archer, which can be upgraded to the Heavy Horse Archer. And finally, in the Stable, you can train the War Elephants, in which they can be upgraded into Armored Elephants. And finally, you can train Ballistas in the Siege Workshop, which can be upgraded to the Helepolis as well. Great, now that we've covered the basics of all military units, I want to address one final thing quickly before we jump into the counters. Military upgrade costs in Return of Rome are quite cheap and affordable, so upgrading your units immediately is usually a no-brainer as soon as you make the decision to go for them. For example, the upgrade cost of Improved Bowman is only 180 food and 100 wood, and Broadsword is even cheaper at 140 food and 50 gold. So units like Improved Bowman and Short Swordsman rarely get any action because they do get upgraded as soon as players can afford them, which most of the time time isn't that difficult. That said, the only exception to this rule are the legendary upgrades in the Iron Age, which are the golden aura units in the very late game. These upgrades are a substantial step up from the previous unit, and their upgrade cost is around 10 times the cost of other upgrades. In other words, while upgrading your unit is a no-brainer in all games depending on which composition you go with, getting the final Iron Age upgrade is sometimes not the correct decision depending on your economy and gold left on the map. Think of these upgrades as the Paladin upgrade in AoE2. Although it's very expensive, it's still researched very frequently in team games and situationally in 1v1s depending on the game. So yeah, although the final upgrade price tag may initially shock you, I will go through why the golden units can make or break the battle in the upcoming section. And as a final quick note, the old additional tech requirements for the final military upgrades, such as requiring fanaticism in the temple to research the final Legion upgrade, have all been lifted in the Return of Rome DLC. Hence, this is a slight buff for all late game units, as the only unit that requires the technology to unlock them are the Chariot units through the wheel upgrade in the market. All others can be upgraded immediately as soon as you can afford them. Alright, with those out of the way, I will now visualize the engagement summary of every available unit in the game. Keep in mind that the assertions that I make here are primarily based on equal resource engagements, but I will include further nuance depending on the unit. In the Stone Age, Clubmen are weak and should be upgraded to the Axeman if trained in most cases. You can even fight them with your own villagers whenever you outnumber them, so they don't really pose much of a threat. That said, in the Tool Age, Axemen are great into villagers and scouts, but lose to Bowman and situationally lose to a microed Slinger mass as well. Bowmen are great into villagers and Axemen, but get wrecked by both scouts and Slingers. Slingers are good against Bowmen, situational into Axemen and raiding villagers, and weak against scouts. Scouts are good into bowmen, slingers, and villagers, but should choose not to fight against the axemen because they lose. As mentioned before, combat completely shifts in the Bronze Age. To start off with the barracks, Swordsmen win against every single melee unit in equal resources except the Hoplite. That said, they do die to all Archer Micro of Chariot Archers and Composite Bowman. Priests are not a good option against them either, as they're too easy to spam and not worth the conversion. Chariot Archers handle both the Swordsmen and the Hoplites pretty easily, as well as priests in particular, but they don't trade effectively into Composite Bowman, Camel Riders, or Cavalry. If you can micro them forever and retain your mass, they're situationally decent into Chariots. Composite Bowmen are good into Swordsmen, Hoplites, Chariot Archers, and Priests, but they lose against all mounted units. If you can protect them, they'll still be able to dish out some damage, but they will die as soon as they're caught. Chariots are fantastic against Priests, good against Composite Bowmen, and situational against Chariot Archers if you can catch them. They lose to every other unit in the Bronze Age. Cavalry are good against Chariot Archers, Composite Bowmen, and Chariots, but they do not trade well against the Swordsmen, the Hoplites, as well as the Camel Riders. They technically also get countered by Priests in low numbers, as they are worth it to convert. The Camel Rider trades well into Cavalry, Chariots, Composite Bowmen, and Chariot Archers, but they don't do well against both the Swordsmen and the Hoplites. Once again, in low numbers, Priests are also decent against them. And finally, the Hoplite destroys all melee units, but conversely gets wrecked by all range units as well as Priests in low numbers. The Bronze Age Priest is basically situationally useful into expensive units of Cavalry, Camel Riders, and Hoplites. It's usually not a good idea to use them against any other Bronze Age unit. Because combat differs a lot, I will divide the final age into the Early Iron Age and Post-Iron Age. Let's start with the Early Iron Age. The Longswordsmen trade cost effectively against almost all melee units with the exception of the War Elephant and the Phalangite. Even though they can soak up a lot of arrows, they still eventually die to Horse Archers, Composite Bowmen, and Elephant Archers. Also, they do get wrecked by the Ballista, and Priests remain a bad option against them. The Elephant Archer trades cost effectively against every single Archer unit, including the fully upgraded Heavy Horse Archers. They're also decent into the slow Barracks and Academy units as well. That said, they will lose to the Camel Riders from the Bronze Age and any melee mounted unit in the Iron Age as they are too slow and will get caught out. Of course, remember that their biggest bane is the Priest, who will comfortably convert them from a very safe distance. Horse Archers are good into all infantry units, and can situationally win against enemy mounted units when massed and microed. This isn't a guaranteed win though, and requires both micro and macro to pull off, not to mention that the speed difference is only 0.2. The exception here are the War Elephants, as they are too slow and will get easily shredded. That said, do keep in mind that they don't trade well into the Bronze Age Composite Bowmen as well as the Elephant Archers, but because they're significantly faster, they can choose not to engage against them. They also handle Priests very well due to their speed and range. Scythe Chariots are good into all range units but situational into Horse Archers as discussed. They lose against long swords and equal resources, are horrible into Phalangites and War Elephants, but trade positively into Heavy Cavalry. Of course, they're still fantastic into Priests due to their conversion resistance. Heavy cavalry do not trade well into either the Bronze Age Camel Riders or the Scythe Chariots as mentioned. They also get destroyed by long swords, Phalangites, and war elephants. They can also get converted by priests in low numbers too. That said, it's not all bad as they can deal with all ranged units, including situationally into horse archers, and, of course, any siege units. The heavy cavalry may seem like a bad unit based on this, but remember that they can get upgraded to Cataphracts, which I'll cover in a moment. War elephants can deal with all units if they can catch up to them in melee range, and the only exception to this rule are the Phalangites. Of course, priests can convert them from a very long range, so they do get hard countered like their elephant archer cousins. Also, even though they can soak up a lot of arrow fire, they will eventually die to range units since they can be kited forever. Phalangites are pretty much the same as the Hoplites but for the Iron Age. Absolutely no one can stand in their way at melee range, but they can be easily converted by priests, shot down by ballistas, or die by 1,000 cuts from kiting range units. And finally, let's cover the post-Iron Age, which are the fully upgraded units in the game. The Legionaries trade cost effectively against almost all melee units, and this time including the armored elephants. So yes, although you can use your war elephants to trade well into longswords, you cannot do that against the Legionaries with your armored elephants. That said, the same Academy exception of the Centurions apply here. As mentioned before, they can soak up a lot of arrows, but they will still eventually die to heavy horse archers, composite bowmen, and elephant archers. They also get wrecked by the Ballista and Helepolis. The heavy horse archer is similar to the horse archer, but with a very important distinction. They move at a speed of 2.5 instead of the 2.2 of the horse archer and 2.0 of other mounted units. This makes their hit and run significantly easier. Hence, when massed, you can make the argument that they should win at the hands of a skilled player against the Cataphract. But remember that this requires a lot of attention and APM. Cataphracts can soak up so much damage, so if they have ranged help on their end, heavy horse archers cannot hit and run forever into their base that they need to defend. When used offensively on open fields though, they should be able to handle Cataphracts. Heavy horse archers do slightly win with equal resources against the Composite Bowman, but that's after the 1750 food and 800 gold investment, and they still cost 3.5 times more gold per unit. Hence, even in the very late game, Composite Bowmen are still arguably a decent response to them due to the favorable trade and gold value, but remember that the horse archer can choose not to engage. Hence, apart from Cataphracts in general and composite bowmen or elephant archers from range, you don't have other options to respond to a horse archer mass. Maybe you can use the Chariot Archers to force your opponent to run out of gold, but that assumes you can sustain prolonged military losses. In other words, you ideally want to stop your opponent from getting to a heavy horse archer mass in the first place. Cataphracts perform significantly better than the heavy cavalry, as they can confidently engage into pretty much all but 4 units, which are the Legionaries, Centurions, and armored elephants in equal resources, and priests in low numbers where your opponent can micro and convert. Every other military unit in the game will fall against them, and yes, that includes the Camel Riders and the Scythe Chariots. Once again, their interaction against heavy horse archers are situational, so depending on your skill level or position in the game, it may be okay in certain scenarios and not in others. You'll have to decide that by yourself based on each game and player. Armored elephants basically perform the same as the war elephant did in the early Iron Age, as they can deal with all units if they can catch up to them in melee range, and the only exception to this rule are the Centurions. Priests are still their hardest counter, and tons of arrows will still bring them down. Centurions follow the same path as the Phalangites, in which no melee unit can stand in their path, but the usual counters of priests in low numbers and tons of arrow fire as well as the Ballista line will make short work of them. Although we've covered the Ballista line at this point through others, let's summarize them as well. They decimate slow-moving units like the Legion line, Academy units, and the Elephants, but they obviously don't do well into fast-mounted units or even cheaper range units who can focus them down like the Composite Bowman. As long as you can keep them protected, they will deal a lot of damage for you, so keep that in mind. Thank you for spending some of your time with us, as that wraps up my summary of military and combat in Return of Rome. Be sure to check out parts 1, 2, and 4 if you haven't already to get up to speed on all aspects of the game. I hope you found this guide helpful, and I would appreciate it if you could share it with others who you think might find it helpful as well. As always, thanks for watching everyone. Be sure to subscribe for more AoE content, and see you all in the next one.